I'm not sure I agree with that. We have that here in the UK and we completely take it for granted. Of course abortion won't cure poverty, but you see she's not answering the question. Hey guys, and welcome back to another Legal Queen React. So this week I've been particularly interested in the recent decision made in the USA around the case of Roe versus Wade, all about abortion and whether or not women are able to have an abortion or they're not able to have an abortion. So yeah, some interesting stuff has been coming out. Let's take a look. That sounds a bit too much like the news.
I actually
Going over to Laura, let's take a look at the weather.
I quite like it though.
The future of Roe versus Wade. And you've heard us say that a lot this week, Roe v. Wade or Roe versus Wade, but some may not really know what or who these people were. So we want to break that down for you today. ABC 10's Lena Howland is live at the Capitol this morning. Lena, can you tell us about the significance of this case in our country?
Yeah, Bria, good morning. The significance of this case, you know, Roe v. Wade is the name of that original lawsuit which led to the landmark Supreme Court decision all the way back in 1973. And that is what established a woman's right to an abortion in the United States. So let's break that down for you. Roe is short for Jane Roe, and that's actually a pseudonym for a woman named Norma McCorvey. She was 22 years old, unmarried, unemployed, and pregnant for the third time in 1969 when she wanted to have an abortion in 1969. But by the time the Supreme Court ruled in her favor, she had already given birth and put the baby up for adoption. Wade, short for Henry Wade, was the district attorney of Dallas County in Texas at the time, and it was his job to enforce a state law which banned abortions except to save a woman's life, meaning Wade was the person McCorvey sued when she sought the abortion in the first place. But despite that win nearly 50 years ago, UC Davis professor Lisa Aikimoto told us a majority of the Supreme Court does have the ability to go back and decide there is no constitutional right to an abortion.
That means it leaves the issue to the state legislatures and the state governors. So that means in some states, the state legislatures could decide to enact bans or very severe restrictions on access to abortion.
Okay, I just want to stop it there for a second because obviously this is a lot of USA law, and of course I generally talk about UK law. But the Constitution, abortion used to be part of the Constitution. And what's happened this week, which is why it's so significant, is that it's no longer part of the Constitution, which means that it's now down to each individual state to regulate abortion, which kind of leaves women a little bit up in the air while that process is taking place. But the significancy for those of you maybe not too sure is that it's been removed from the American Constitution, the right to have that abortion.
But in other states, they might step forward, and several states have already done so, to provide strong protections for the right to decide.
If Roe v. Wade does get reversed, it would not outlaw abortions altogether across the country, but it would be up to each individual state to decide. So if this does move forward, 26 states are either certain or likely to ban abortion, while other Democratic states, such as California, could see an influx of women coming in from out of state seeking care for abortions.
Yeah, Lena, it's really good to know the history when you want to make your own informed opinion on something. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Economists are now predicting that child poverty, the rate of that is going to go up. Many of these states that are now banning abortion do not have paid family leave. They do not have the extended Medicaid for after giving, women who give birth. So if you could explain a little bit more about how you're going to fight for these disadvantaged women who wanted to get an abortion, they couldn't because of the state they live in, and their children who are growing up in poverty.
Well, we've been fighting for these women and their families for 50 years. It's in fact the abortion industry and what we hear on campuses all the time that tells women that abortion is a simple solution to all their problems. When in fact we believe in helping those who suffer, not eliminating somebody who may potentially suffer. And I think you help suffering, you help alleviate the suffering. You don't say, well, we're going to solve that by just
I've got to say, though, that the only reason she's in poverty is because now she can't work because she's had the baby. So I think what the broadcaster was saying is, you know, these women who are now going to be forced to keep their babies, regardless of the fact that the state that they live in won't offer them any financial assistance when they can't work, and therefore creates poverty. This lady is saying, yes, but abortion won't cure poverty. But that's not what the broadcaster was saying. And you know, of course abortion won't cure poverty. That's just ridiculous. But these women who can't work because they've been forced to have the baby are going to potentially end up in poverty.
Alongside someone and seeking social justice with that person. And that's what we've been doing through the pregnancy center movement for nearly 50 years.
But what if, well, first of all, I hear what you're saying, but the reality is, I think it's nearly half 500,000 kids end up in foster care. Now, I don't know how many of those were kids that, you know, the mother wanted to abort and came from a disadvantaged home. But the reality is, you say that you're working on this, but so many kids still end up abused, neglect in the broken foster care system. And the reality is the governments in these states do not have the resources on the books, such as paid family leave, such as the extended Medicaid, to help with these situations.
We can definitely talk about those policies, but the question is the solution to children in foster care to kill them? No one would argue in our society.
That is just a ridiculous counter argument, because we're not talking about killing children. We're talking about an unborn fetus whereby the mother wishes to terminate her pregnancy. That you know, I can totally accept that this lady has a view that is opposing to the broadcaster's view. However, what I can't accept is her arguments to support that view. It's completely and utterly flawed.
That because a child's in foster care, therefore their life is unworthy of living. And that's the point that we're making in the pro-life movement every single day when we argue for protection at conception. That just because someone may suffer in their life, it doesn't mean we should snuff them out of existence, that we should violently end their life when they've done nothing wrong. And I think that's the important part to start the conversation.
And I want to get to that because you bring up two important points, your view that life begins at conception, but also your view that even bans like in Missouri, which bans abortion even in the case of rape or incest, that you support that. So under those laws, a 12-year-old could be raped and still be forced to carry that baby to term. Is that what you want? Is that the kind of thing you support?
I absolutely don't want 12-year-olds to be raped.
Right,
but you see, she's not answering the question. That wasn't the question that she was asked.
That
don't want
happens.
12-year-olds
Unfortunately,
to
that's
be
the
pregnant.
reality of the world we live in.
Absolutely. We definitely see these tragedies, and I think we need to do a better job in enforcing penalties on these people who commit heinous crimes.
But do you think the 12-year-old...
How unrealistic a vision is that? You know, if a 12-year-old child is raped and is therefore forced to carry that baby to term, the solution to that problem wasn't to enable the 12-year-old to have an abortion. It was actually, let's increase penalties for the crime of rape. How does that stop rape? How does that stop? You know, women have been raped since the dawn of time. We are a sophisticated society. If we were able to stop that from happening, we would have done it by now. I think all the penalties in the world aren't going to stop every rapist for committing that crime. It doesn't do anything to help the 12-year-old that's been forced to carry that baby to term.
should carry that.
But I don't believe in discrimination against a human being based on the circumstances of their conception, because we don't issue birth certificates in our nation and give
But you do discriminate against the person because you're actually discriminating against the 12-year-old child.
Gold stars or silver stars as to how you were conceived. We say, no, you are a human being with rights and you should be.
But those rights of the unborn fetus at the moment of conception outweigh the rights of the 12-year-old girl? How can that be right? How can that be right?
protected.
So what
And
I hear
that's
you saying
that's what we believe as a movement. And I think I actually think you should speak with folks like my friend Ryan Baumberger, who was actually conceived in rape, whose mother made a courageous decision to place him with an adoptive family, and talk with the tens of thousands of.
But that was her choice. That was her choice. She wanted that baby regardless of the circumstance that she'd been raped, and more power to her. She had that choice. She made that choice. But if we go back to the original example that the reporter is talking about, a 12-year-old girl may not want to make that same choice.
Americans who are living today, who have families, who were conceived in sexual assault, that every single time we talk about abortion in America, we bring these human beings up as if their lives don't matter and they don't have value. And I simply reject that.
Yeah, and that's not what we're saying. The question was about, should a 12-year-old carry a baby to term if that 12-year-old was raped? Clearly you think, yes, that is the case. And we have talked to many people who were born even though their mother was raped, or even though their mother considered having an abortion and chose not to. We've talked to people all across the spectrum. But you are arguing that your Catholic faith dictates that the life begins at the moment of conception. There is a synagogue in Florida that has filed suit claiming that in Jewish law, abortion is required if necessary to protect the health, mental, or physical well-being of the woman. Why should your religious beliefs trump theirs?
It's not my faith that tells me that life begins at conception. It's science.
Well, there's plenty of scientists, as you know.
96% of biologists agree that the moment of conception, a unique human life comes into existence. There's no other moment when that DNA codes. Where are you getting
the 96% of biologists? Where does that come from specifically?
That's a study from Chicago, University of Chicago.
Okay,
but
my producer will look that up because I've read many opinions preparing for this segment of doctor. I just want to be clear with our viewers
but that's science. You can debate whether or not that human life has value. My faith tells me that human life has value,
among scientists.
and that faith tells me that human life should be protected. But science tells us at the moment of conception, when egg and sperm unite, a unique genetic code comes into existence that's never existed before and will never exist again. That is, in fact, the moment when a human being comes into existence. That is indisputable.
There's not a consensus among scientists. There is absolutely not.
Well, they should be scientists if there's not a consensus.
Well, and let me walk you through what many scientists have said. I've read all sides of it today.
Sure.
I've read from various scientists. First of all, there is a general view that a baby, a fetus, reaches viability between, I believe, it is 24 to 28 weeks in the womb.
Right.
There is a view that when the egg it meets the sperm and it becomes an embryo, that it is just a cluster of cells. That it is not.
I'm just a cluster of cells. What makes me different?
I know,
than
and I've heard
embryo?
you say that, but I'll tell you right now. So what about it? And this is, I am not taking a position, but I like to challenge and test
this is fun.
views. Yeah, exactly. I think that
I like having this discussion. This is important.
So, if a woman goes in, she can't get pregnant on her own. So in a lab, they have to take, they have to do it scientifically. In a lab, they have to put the egg and the sperm together to create an embryo. In the process of trying to get this woman pregnant, a doctor destroys the embryos because that's just what happens. Is that doctor then a murderer?
Yes, doctors ending human life. We don't define it as
trying to get a woman pregnant.
I just don't agree with the fact that a cluster of cells should take precedent over the lady carrying the cluster of cells. Surely that human being, her rights have to play significantly more and take priority over the cluster of cells rights. It's a cluster of cells. That's all it is.
Should be banned.
It depends on the procedure that is used in IVF.
But sometimes that's just what happens.
But there's also the question of intentionality as well.
I'm not saying.
I had a question posed to me recently on campus where someone said, well, if a woman's having a miscarriage, do you consider her being a murderer? Absolutely not. That's something that is unintended and is sad. And just because if a woman may be at risk.
But then that goes back to the 12-year-old girl example. You know, that 12-year-old girl, that was unintentional. She didn't want to have sex. She was 12. She was raped. Therefore, how is that right that she then keeps that child because that happened to her? That was unintentional.
for miscarriage. We don't consider her a murderer because she has an unfortunate situation.
That wasn't my
intention is not
question.
there.
And I see what you're saying, but I'm talking about a doctor who was trying to help a woman get pregnant, and through the process, embryos have to be destroyed. That doctor is a murderer, even though
no embryos should have to ever be destroyed in IVF.
So, okay, well, it does happen. That's just the bottom line. And also, there are so many embryos frozen as well that these IVF clinics oversee. So, what about that?
And I think that's what we've been talking about, intentionality. I would say that when we talk about pro-life laws, this isn't even discussed. So when we're talking about what's next in a post-Roe America, the discussion of IVF isn't even on the table. We're talking about ending human life intentionally.
But is it human life? I think therein lies the age-old debate, doesn't it? Is it human life? It's a cluster of cells at conception. Can it really be described as human life at that point?
Numbering children who have limbs, whose arms and legs have to be removed from a woman's body and put back together. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about seeking laws to protect women against the predatory abortion facility.
What's the Supreme Court going to do about abortion? They're not really going to overturn Roe versus Wade, are they? They can't do that, can they? I can't tell you how many people have asked me questions like this in recent months. It makes sense. I have argued 2 abortion cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, including the 1992 case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is credited with saving Roe versus Wade. I was a co-founder of the Center for Reproductive Rights, and I spent 20 years of my career arguing on behalf of women who needed abortions and other reproductive health care. So my answer is depressing but direct. Roe versus Wade will be dead within the year. The constitutional right to choose whether or not to have an abortion will no longer be protected by the United States Constitution. This court is likely to overrule Roe and Casey or so undermine its meaning that it will be effectively unavailable for use. Now, I heard your gasps. I'm going to say it again. The federal Constitution of the United States will no longer protect reproductive freedom. Now, I'm also here to tell you that there's hope.
I wonder why they did that. I wonder why the Supreme... Because we obviously know now that what she's saying is true, but I wonder why they did that. I don't know enough about the case or indeed American law to be able to offer an academic view, but my personal view would tell me to question, why did they do that? Why have they now left it to the hands of the state? Because let's say that in California, adoption is still going to be made available to those ladies if they choose to have an abortion. But in Texas, for example, it's no longer you're no longer able to have an abortion in Texas. Then all the ladies in Texas will simply go to California. I don't see what, unless, I don't know. Maybe you can put it in the comments.
That we can preserve by working together our reproductive freedoms. And by that I mean more than just the right to choose abortion. By that I mean the ability to make decisions about becoming parents. All people should have that right. Whatever their race, whatever their gender, whoever they love, all people ought to have the right to decide to become parents and the social supports that are necessary to raise those children.
I think that's key, isn't it? You know, people who find themselves in that position of having to decide whether or not to keep their child is because of so many outside factors. You know, are they in a relationship with the other parent? Do they have the ability, the financial ability, first of all, to be able to care for that child? Do they have the emotional ability? Are they of age? Do they have the required experience of life? I don't mean of being a parent, but just of life, to be able to watch over that child. There's just so much more that plays into it.
With dignity and in safety. So, opponents argue three things when they say they want to ban abortion. They talk about religion, they talk about protection of fetal rights, they talk about protection of women's health. So let's take those each in turn. Religion. You know, the reality of the world is that the world's religions have wide variety of views on abortion, and many support them in a whole range of different circumstances. So when abortion opponents say religion, they're really just imposing their religion on the rest of us. And what about protection of fetal rights? If in fact you cared about protecting fetal rights, you'd spend a lot of time working to eliminate the alarming rate of infant mortality in this country. Because in the United States, we have one of the highest rates of infant mortality in the developed world. They also should be supporting programs for children once they are born. And, you know, what about the protection of women's health? Well, the reality is abortion is already an extremely safe surgical procedure. It is safer than childbirth. And imposing new restrictions on abortion only makes it less safe. In my view, what we're really talking about, this fixation on abortion.
She makes a really good point there, actually, because if abortion is made illegal in some states, women are still going to want abortions. Therefore, what do? They're going to go to what we had years and years and years ago, backstreet abortions. I mean, they've been going on for years, years old. Backstreet abortions, which isn't good for either baby or mom.
Abortion by opponents, those people who want to ban abortion, is all about controlling women. And women are unable to operate, to be equal participants in our society if we cannot control whether, when, and with whom we have children. We cannot exercise the fundamental human rights to make decisions about our bodies and our destinies. So
I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm not sure that the decision made was necessarily to control women. I think that there is recognition for the opponent's view of protecting the unborn life. And, you know, maybe that's why actually the court made that decision. Now I think about it, maybe because it is such a hot potato. You know, who do you give more credence to? The lady who is, you know, a human being too, or this unborn fetus who some say would say that came to be a human life at the point of conception? Who do you give more power to? Who has the legal right there? So maybe that's why the court decided, actually, we'll let the state decide that one, depending upon perhaps some statistics within that state. I don't know, maybe they're going to look at abortion rates, maybe they're going to look at child mortality rates, maybe they're going to look at social care in that individual state before making their decision. How many children are adopted in each particular state? Because I'm sure it differs from state to state. So maybe that's one of the reasons why they're going to give the state the responsibility of making that decision.
why am I so convinced that the Supreme Court is going to overrule Roe and Casey and take what is clearly a radical step? Now, interestingly enough, I learned everything I needed to know to be successful in the Supreme Court on Sesame Street. Why? Because you gotta learn to count. And the only number that matters is 5, which is a majority of the justices on the court. Now, when Casey went to the High Court in 1992, I was convinced that there were 5 justices then prepared to overrule Roe and return to the states the ability to ban abortion. I was correct. Right after my argument, the justices returned to their conference room and took a vote, and 7 justices voted to uphold the Pennsylvania restrictions that were at issue in the case. And then Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote a draft opinion. While he never said the magic words that Roe is fatal, as Justice John Paul Stevens recently wrote in his memoir, the opinion effectively repudiated the central holding of Roe. Now, luckily, that opinion was never filed in 1992. At the last minute, Justice Anthony Kennedy changed his mind, and together with Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and David Souter, they issued what they called a joint opinion, and in it they upheld the right of women to obtain abortion up until viability, usually between 24 and 28 weeks of pregnancy, in all 50 states and U.S. territories. But the Casey decision went a little further, and it permitted states to enact barriers to abortion as long as they weren't undue burdens on women. And as a result, in the following 3 decades, we've seen states pass hundreds of restrictions on abortion, and the increasingly conservative courts uphold those restrictions.
So essentially what she's saying is that she is so confident that the Wade versus Roe or Roe versus Wade decision is going to be overturned is because since it was initially made, more and more of the states are actually imposing more restrictions on abortion. And she now feels that there's been a turn, if you like, of opinion across her country that will now leave the Supreme Court with no choice but to actually pass it back, pass that decision making back to the states of America. And that to have it within the Constitution perhaps isn't going to work because of these restrictions that the states are putting on abortion since the decision of Roe versus Wade.
Today, about 11% of the counties in this country that actually have an abortion provider. There are 6 states that have 1 abortion provider. As we know, in the days before Roe, women with means were able to get abortions. Other women, on the other hand, even today, low-income women, women who live in rural areas, teenagers, women of color, women who are disabled, all of whom have difficulty accessing safe and affordable abortion.
And that's her example of these restrictions. So whilst abortion prior to the decision was legal all across the US, within the individual states, they were saying, well, whilst it's legal, we're actually going to only offer 1 abortion clinic in the whole of the state. So how does a rural woman attend that, for example? We're going to make abortions expensive. Well, how does a woman of low income afford the abortion then? So whilst the overarching rule was you can have an abortion if you so wish, this is prior obviously to the decision that's been made now, it was incredibly difficult is what she's saying, that since 1973 and that decision was made, the states are making it more and more difficult to get an abortion. And hence that's why she feels that the decision made in Roe versus Wade will now be overturned.
Now, the question is, what's going to happen now? And unfortunately, things are going to get worse. There are currently 3 cases pending in the Supreme Court, 2 from Texas and 1 from Mississippi. Now, most of you probably have been following the Texas situation. Texas passed a ban on abortion at about 6 weeks of pregnancy. It allowed any individual to sue abortion providers. Vigilantes could collect a bounty of $10,000 for a violation of the law.
Wow. I mean, who would want to do an abortion then in that state of Texas if that's what Texas government is enabling? You know, that you can be sued by anybody, even if you weren't the person that had the abortion or the father or the family member, or you could be anybody. If you see an abortion clinic, you can then go and sue them. That's ridiculous.
And as a result, many, many clinics, probably most of the clinics in Texas, have closed their doors or have decreased the number of abortions they've performed. It's difficult. But the critical piece about Texas is that 5 justices, remember that number 5 justices already voted to permit the Texas law to go into effect. And besides the harm for women, those justices are not really considering the constitutionality of the act, only who can be sued and where. The more important case is out of Mississippi. There's a ban on abortion at 15 weeks of pregnancy. Arguments were heard this week. And in my view, we are likely to see at least 5 justices overrule Roe and Casey and send the question of abortion back to the states. Sesame Street, 5 votes. And unfortunately, this time around, there is no Justice Kennedy to save us. Now, what's going to happen when Roe and Casey are overturned? I'd guess that about half the states in this country will ban all or most abortions. We're likely to see bans stretching from Georgia all the way west to Texas, from Idaho all the way south to Arizona. Women, like Texan women, will be forced to travel to the 15 states that are controlled by pro-choice legislators and governors. Other women will seek medication abortion using the internet.
So now what she's talking about is how people are going to get around it. Because as I said to you earlier, even though abortion has now been taken out of the Constitution and the power has been passed back to the states, she's saying, over half of them will actually make abortion illegal. Women are still going to want abortions. So now it becomes dangerous. Now it potentially becomes very, very dangerous for the women.
Or gray or black markets and subject themselves in some states to criminal prosecutions. Still, other women will carry their unintended pregnancies to term. The bottom line is, this is not a pretty picture. So, what now? What can we do? We have been saying for 5 decades, save Roe, save Roe, save Roe. That strategy is no longer feasible. Give it up. We got to make sure we quit hitting our heads against the marble staircase and try to find new strategies. So I'm going to propose 2 of them to you today. First, we've got to build a badass social justice movement. Which means loudly crying for our rights, loudly saying this is something that belongs to us. We know from watching the Black Lives Matter movement and the marriage equality movement that coalition is queen. We've got to find allies and work with them to make sure our rights are protected. But equally important, we've got to ensure that we elect, and I'd actually say more important, is we've got to elect legislators throughout the states and in Congress who are champions for reproductive health. Now, I'm not going to bother to tell you all how to get politically active. This is a crowd that knows how to do it. But knowing how to do it and actually doing it are 2 different things. So what you need to do is get politically active. But one of the things I will tell you.
So essentially what she's saying is, look, we have to do something, and 2 things that she's suggesting here is that they improve the social justice system and that actually we start to really think about who we're picking as the future politicians of America. Because whilst there's a big majority of people who think it's important that women should still have the right to choose whether or not they have an abortion, perhaps as a society, she's suggesting, that they've become a little bit lazy as to, when they're picking their politicians and they're not actually being as proactive as they could be when selecting what's important in terms of, rights for women moving forward, etc. And that maybe that's where the attention should be directed at.
Things I will tell you is, what would our world look like if we were able to wrest the reins of governmental power away from those who oppose abortion and allow an agenda that reflects reproductive freedoms and justice? Picture this. We would have childcare and universal childhood education in every community in this country. We would have paid maternity and paternity leaves, and people would actually take them. All working parents ought to have that right.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we have that here in the UK and we completely take it for granted. And especially as an English lawyer, hearing that blows my mind, that you in America don't have maternal leave, what we call maternity leave. That's just mind-blowing.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, African American women, Native American women, Alaska Native women are dying of pregnancy-related causes at 3 times the rate of white women. And most of those deaths are preventable. So in our world where we control the reins of power, we would ensure that there were programs to reduce this alarming rate of maternal mortality. And we would make sure that the systemic racism in our healthcare system would be eliminated. And we'd work to eliminate infertility with special programs for women who can't get pregnant. And we would make sure that all women are entitled to healthcare services at all stages of their life. Now, all of those things I've talked about are family-friendly policies and ought to be supported by our opponents as well. I'll wait to see if that's the case. But in my world, where we control the reins of power, we would do more. The birth control pill would be available over the counter. Okay, as easy to get as a bottle of Tylenol. And we'd have quality sex education in every public school in this country. And we would make sure that abortion is affordable and available. No more bans, no more barriers, no more restrictions on funding. And medication abortion, the abortion pill, would be available not just at Planned Parenthoods and
Again, it's completely alien to me, because in the UK, you can actually, if you decide that you want an abortion, have that on the NHS, which is our, medical provision. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything to have an abortion here in the UK.
Abortion clinics in this country, but at pharmacies without a prescription, at walk-in health centers, and on every college campus in the United States. And if you had any doubt about...
I mean, the age-old argument about allowing the pill to be handed over the counter, particularly in the UK, I've heard this argument, is that then are you potentially encouraging children to have sex? So, here in the UK, it's legal after the age of 16 to have sexual intercourse with another. But are you potentially making it a more viable option for 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds? Because if you can go in and buy the pill over the counter, perhaps you are encouraging, kids to be promiscuous, shall we say. That's the counter of that argument.
About the importance of getting politically active. We could also pass a constitutional amendment, what I call a gender equity amendment, that would guarantee to all persons the ability to make decisions, not just about abortion, but about pregnancy and marriage and sexuality and parenting. And it would be a permanent part of the United States Constitution. Now, the important part of that is these rights should not be controlled by politicians. They shouldn't be dependent on where you live or how much money you make or the color of your skin or the person you love or the pronouns you use. These are universal, fundamental human rights, and they ought to be guaranteed in law, in the Constitution, so the Supreme Court cannot willy-nilly.
What she's saying there is that politicians shouldn't be in charge of that, because obviously politicians have their own views and you get different politicians in, so there's going to be a variety of views. It should be the legal system that decides that. In that, it goes back into the Constitution. At the moment, it's been removed from the Constitution. And I agree with her on that point. I think when it comes to, the overarching framework, the legal framework, it should be decided by the court as opposed to the politicians.
Nilly take them away. Now, to do this, we need to elect champions for choice to the 500,000 elected seats in our government in this country. Everything from school boards to town councils to state legislatures to Congress and the White House. All of those seats need to be controlled by champions of our cause. And that can only happen if you get politically active. Your vote, your willingness to work in campaigns, write postcards, make phone calls, knock on doors, can make that happen, and even run for office, because that's what we need to do. Now, while dire, the end of Roe is not the end of the story. To paraphrase Joan Baez, the best antidote to despair is action. And your action, your willingness to work hard, can not only preserve reproductive freedoms for ourselves, but for our children as well.
How it will actually affect you, no matter how or where you are watching right now. 13 states have these so-called trigger laws in place for this very circumstance of Roe being overturned, meaning laws that go into effect very quickly now to ban abortion, according to the abortion rights group, the Guttmacher Institute. For example, in Kentucky, Louisiana, and South Dakota, it happens immediately, meaning if you had an appointment this morning at 8 for this procedure, you could go through with it. From here on out, no, you cannot, according to what their law has planned there. Then we move to
What about the people that actually run these clinics? I mean, that has a huge impact on them in these particular states, for their employees, for their businesses. That's huge for them. I had no idea that it was going to come into effect immediately in some states.
a second group, the next level, abortion bans to be enforced 30 days after Roe is overturned. That includes Idaho, Texas, and Tennessee. And then come a half dozen states where officials would need to certify their legislation as legally valid before their bans will kick in. That includes North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Now, this could be incredibly quick, or it could take maybe a few days, according to Guttmacher, so they could, in effect, be immediate or a couple of days. And finally, we add in the states that have old, unenforced abortion bans, which could now be enforced, and those that passed bans under Roe, which were blocked by courts. Altogether, you get a whopping 26 states certain or likely to ban abortion, and that's compared to just 16 states and D.C. with laws to protect abortion rights, states which even...
Wow, I mean, essentially looking at that map, it's just the far west and the far east that are going to be making abortions available, potentially, in those states. The whole of the middle of the US. You can't, that's crazy.
Now are preparing for an influx of patients crossing state lines seeking care, and you can imagine what it will be like in Illinois, where it's surrounded on all sides with states that that either have already or very quickly will ban abortion. So
I suppose if you had a clinic in, around Illinois there, Wyoming I think is one, that you could potentially move to Illinois and open up practice there.
what is the severity of these bans? What are we looking at here? Missouri has eyes on targeting even non-residents. If you were to pass through and conceive a child, they would continue on that with if you got an abortion elsewhere. So the laws are very severe, big steps out here that affect every community.
Wow, really interesting. So guys, yeah, that's Roe versus Wade. I learned a lot actually watching those videos. I had no idea that, for example, you could not get a free abortion in the USA. I mean, why would you, I suppose, now I think about it. And the impacts now that decision is going to have, wow. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that, guys. Give me a thumbs up if you like it. Please subscribe to the channel. And of course, leave your comments below. I'd be so interested to read these.